The Modern Maker podcast had a really fun 2x4 challenge I wanted to participate in. The idea was to make anything out of 2x4s. 2x4s have a really strong grain pattern, so I wanted to highlight that, and I thought about making an end-grained stool. The legs would go through the top, forming a mortise and tenon joint. here you can see my finished 2 2x4 challenge project. This challenge came from the Modern Maker podcast. If you haven't listened to it yet, I highly recommend it. So thank you Mike, Ben and Chris. This was a really fun challenge.
I first started to cut sections of plywood for the side panels. I then cross-cut each piece to length. To start drawing the shape, I first started with a 2x2 grid. I then started mapping out the drawing accordingly. I used my jigsaw to make all the cuts. This is not entirely necessary, but I made a template so the curves would match. For the middle section, I first started with finding its highest point and then drew a curve from end to end. For the second panel, I used the first panel as a template to cut out the shape. I repeated this process 4 times. Next, I cut out thinner strips for the support strips. For 2 of the supports, I created notches for the slats to sit in. They look a little bit like pumpkin teeth. I measured the pumpkin teeth and made the cut using a jigsaw. It is helpful to label your cuts so that you don't cut the wrong sections. I started the cut vertically and then finished the cut horizontally once I made enough room for my jigsaw to fit. I repeated this process for the second panel. To make a sturdier frame, I glued 2 of the panels together to create one. I then glued the support strip onto the pumpkin teeth. For the slats, I cut strips to length using my circular saw. I used my orbital sander to sand the edges down smooth. I put a piece of tape on the side of the panel that I wanted to be my front. And then I flipped it over to glue on the support. Once all the pieces dried, I took a 220 grit sandpaper and sanded all over. I finished the side panels with a matte polyacrylic. Assembly is quite simple. I first used heavy blocks to help me hold the side panels together. Once I had the side panels upright, I started inserting the slats, starting from the front and the back. This ensures that everything is square. The bed was strong enough as it was, but just to be safe, we added extra supports under the bed.
So I started this cutting board with some scraps, some 8-quarter walnut, 5-quarter cherry, and 4-quarter maple, all about 13 inches long. The maple had a bit of a twist in it, so I used my planer sled to flatten one face. And once that was flat, I was able to just send it through the planer as usual, and the walnut as usual, and the cherry was pretty flat too. I love my planer. Look how nice that looks. I don't have a planer. Yes, I do. I don't have a jointer. So I used my table saw to square up all the edges on all my pieces. Luckily, most of these pieces were pretty straight, so I didn't have to whip out my jointing jig. It was pretty... Oh no! I hate when that thing falls. Anyway, now it was time to decide how thick I wanted the board to be. So I did it about a bit bigger than 1.25 inches thick, leaving some room for sanding and all of that. So I just ripped through all the pieces of the same thickness. And Microjig did not sponsor this video, but I do love this gripper. It just makes me feel so much safer whenever I'm using the table saw. It's really just so great. I love using it. And then finally I ripped through all the pieces until they were all the same height or thickness. Next up, it was time to cut all these pieces to length. So I used my crosscut sled with a stop block to cut them all to about 8 inches, I would say. I also just love my crosscut sled. I can't say enough about it. It just makes life so much easier and it feels safe. I know it looks really dangerous when it's in fast forward on these videos, but it does feel a lot safer. I do really love it. So I knew I wanted some sort of ombre pattern going on in this board. I just wasn't sure what kind of design. Nope, not that one. But I think this one is good. I think I'll go with this one. I just had to figure out how to glue it up. So I made this jig. It's just scraps screwed to another scrap, which isn't that what all jigs are really made out of. I just kept checking that the 2 angles that made up the Z shape were perfectly square. I pre-drilled all the holes as well, and after screwing down the last piece, I just made sure that it was all square again, just triple checking, quadruple checking. Oh, shoot. Oh, there we go. Phew. Okay. So I lined the jig with some wax paper to prevent my pieces from sticking to the actual jig, and I started the glue up. I'm only going to glue up the first 2 layers on the jig just to create the pattern. Once the pattern is all glued up, I'm not going to need the jig anymore. It's easier to do clamping without the jig. Now you should have a Z or a zigzag or Harry Potter scar. At this point, you could just continue to do the glue up to the Z shape on the clamps. I actually ripped some 2x4s to be the same height as my clamp to help with some support of the pieces. During all the glue up, you can see them hiding in between some of the clamps there. I did this glue up in 3 stages, but I think I probably should have done it in 4 stages, but whatever, next time. That's a lot of clamps, and you still never have enough, right? After it all set up, I had something that looked like this. Pretty cool. I took it on over to the table saw and squared it up as best as I could, and it was time to sand. I used my belt sander to flatten it all up and get rid of some of the glue lines, and I had a little helper. And he just learned a really valuable lesson: don't stand behind the belt sander. Next, I cut off all the corners using my table saw and my miter sled, and onto the router. I just love how a chamfer looks on a cutting board. It's just so clean and crisp, and I absolutely love using this little router. It's just so much fun. And sanding, 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 sanding for life, and finish. I used a mineral oil and beeswax finish, and just look at that. If you have any questions, comment below, and don't forget to subscribe. They'll definitely...
In this video, I'm going to show how I built this bench using box joints where I don't need to cut any joinery. I built a version of a bench like this before with box joints where you build it up layer by layer, alternating big piece, small piece, big piece, small piece, and it creates the same effect. But I wanted to see if there was a different way to do it. So I'm not 100% happy with the execution. I definitely made some mistakes and there are some flaws in it, but in the end I'm happy with the product, I'm happy with the color that I decided to experiment with, I'm happy that I decided to put a shelf for my kids' shoes, and if they actually put their shoes away, I'm going to call this build a success. So let's get started.
I started out by looking at my scrap bin for some plywood. This piece happened to have been 3 feet by 4 feet. Then I used my AccuCut to rip the pieces of plywood into 2 1/4 inch pieces. I started using the AccuCut because I didn't feel so comfortable having this big piece of plywood on my table saw, and then it was just fun to use, so I just kept going. I ripped a total of 14 slats for this project. This is a pretty small bench, so if you want a bigger bench, cut some more. Then I cut the 2x4s down to size. I'll have the measurements on my website. Then I made the 2x4s a little fancier and took the rounded corners off of them by ripping it through the table saw. The 2x4s were a 1/16 thicker than 2 stacked pieces of ply, so I had to send them through the planer to take off a 32nd on each face to make them completely even. Now, instead of gradually building up the bench layer by layer, I decided to glue up 3 different panels, so 2 legs and 1 top. When doing this glue up, I used spacers, the plywood spacers, in the slots where the plywood was going to go. Problem number 1 here was that it had to be spot on perfect, the glue up, and I think I should have cut them a little bit longer so that I could cut them to length afterwards. Now I use a very sophisticated measuring tool, a Minion flip-flop, to figure out how far apart to place the dowels for the shoe storage shelf. I just used 3/4 inch dowels to create the shelf and used a Forstner bit at my drill press to drill holes deep enough to house the dowels. Now that the legs are done, I worked on the top. I cut the plywood to size and started the glue up. This is where everything went wrong. I think the problem was that I tried to glue it up all at one time. What I think I should have done was glued it up into sections and made the plywood the bigger chunks at first, so like glue up all the longer pieces together and glue up all the shorter pieces together. So I was also distracted. I was on my phone a little bit. That definitely doesn't help. But I had these spacers in there that were the exact width and thickness that I needed, and still something shifted. It just was not good. So if I were to do this again, I would glue it up in sections first to eliminate any slippage that could happen in the glue up. Off camera, I cleaned up all the pieces by sending them through the planer. You could also just sand them. Then I started the assembly. I put glue in the holes for the dowels and then just put glue in each one of the joints, and then just went to town with my mallet. I gotta be honest, this was not the easiest glue up. It was just a little bit stressful. I was not prepared for how hard it was going to be, and I didn't have all my clamps ready, and I got a little bit ugly over here. But I got through it and it was done. So since I sent the pieces through the planer to clean them up, they weren't an exact fit anymore, and I needed to use a belt sander to flush up all the joints. There's also that glue up mishap. Let me explain. Even though I took those precautions during the glue up of the top of putting the spacers in between the slats, something went wrong, something did not go well, and there, can you see? There is a gap. So these joints over here are amazing, super tight. Over here, there is a gap. And that means that one of them is great on this side and 2 of them are really bad on that side. So what I think I'm gonna do is cut a really thin piece of plywood to fit into there, to fit into those spots and try to fill in the gaps. We'll see. All right, so I cut these thin strips of plywood at the table saw and it fits in there pretty well. So moving on. So after filling in those gaps and sanding them down a little bit, I took my little trim router and chamfered all the edges, which just made me feel so much better about the piece. And then I just did some finish sanding. Since I wasn't 100% happy with the way this build was going, I decided to experiment with some finishes. I used this Weather Wash, which is a natural aging stain. See, it like turns it really cool gray, and I thought it would be cool to experiment with it on plywood. Then my little helper decided that we needed to experiment a little bit more, so we put a whitewash on top of the Weather Wash. This creates a really cool gray color, in my opinion. I sanded down the whitewash on the top a little bit to reveal more of the end grain plywood, and then I used a polyacrylic to seal it. I used a polyacrylic because it is non-yellowing when you use light colored stains. And after 3 coats, the project was done. I think it looks really cool. I love the box joints, and I love the exposed plywood, and I love the shoe shelf. So I think next time around I'm going to experiment with some real box joints and see how easy it is to actually do those.
Armed with the measurements of my IKEA twin mattress, I set off to get supplies. I had the nice people at Home Depot cut a single sheet of plywood down to size so that it would fit in the car. Back at the shop, I clamped down a guide and used my circular saw to cut the lengthwise excess into 3 equal pieces that I would use as support for the underside of the bed. I applied a thick but even layer of wood glue before attaching the support to the underside of the bed. I clamped the support into place and attached it using 1 1/4 inch screws. I then repeated the process on the opposite side. I then cut 2 smaller supports that would fit snugly in between the 2 lengthwise supports, which I also glued and screwed into place. I used my orbital sander to make sure that all of the edges were flush. I then hand sanded to round over or break the edges of the plywood. I cut the remaining piece of plywood the same width as the bed to make into a headboard. It then underwent the same sanding process. After flipping the bed, I made sure to break the edges on that side as well. We then coated the entire bed in polyacrylic. I drilled 5 evenly spaced holes in a shelf bracket that I got from IKEA. After removing all the metal splinters with a pair of tweezers, I used it as a template to draw corresponding holes on the second bracket. I used construction adhesive in between the 2 brackets before connecting them with nuts and bolts. I then drilled 4 holes in the bottom of the now doubled bracket. We screwed the brackets into place using a flexible bit holder attachment for the drill. I drilled 3 holes on the 2 remaining shelf brackets before attaching them to the headboard, leaving about 1 inch of an overhang. I then attached the headboard to the bed.
I love sliding barn doors. I think that they are very decorative as well as functional. So stay tuned and I will show you how I made these.
I started with my 1/2 inch siding, and since these are tongue and groove boards, I cut off the tongue, then laid out my marks and cut to size my door. Then I just repeated the steps to make a second door. Next, I grabbed the 3/8 plywood and started cutting strips that would later become the trim. Then I went over everything and gave it a good sanding. To get into the grooves, I actually wrapped a carpenter's pencil in some sandpaper. Then I started measuring everything to cut my trim pieces. Once they were cut, I then glued and nailed them in place. With the doors done, then I just started prepping for paint. While I was painting, I went ahead and painted the dowel. With all of that drying, I stuck my 1/8 inch flat bar in my vise, then used a Sawzall to start cutting strips. For the hardware, I use a pulley that has a bearing in the center that rotates independently from the outside. But if you attach a flat bar directly to it, it can no longer rotate. So instead, I stuck 3 washers in the center, attached the flat bar, and now it has clearance to rotate. But before moving forward, I like to give all my hardware a quick painting, making sure not to paint the threads. For the flat bar, I first lay out my marks, then drill the holes, starting with a smaller bit and then stepping up to 1/2 inch. Then I moved back to the door to router and a handle on the back side. If you want to be smarter than me, you would do this before you painted the back. With the hardware dry, I then started mounting it, making sure I left at least 5 inches hanging off of the door. I started with the pilot hole and then moved up to 1/2 inch. I used a flat washer and a bolt on both of the bottom holes, then a flat washer and a nut on the back. To attach the wheel, I use a washer and a bolt through the flat bar, then put the wheel on with 3 stacked washers in the center. Once that's sandwiched together, I then put another washer on the back side and tighten it down with a nut. Next, I went ahead and grabbed a 1x4, cut it to size, and gave it a quick coat of paint. While that was drying, I laid the door on its side, then used a right angle grinder to cut off the tails of the bolts. This will reduce how far off of the wall you have to mount your door. To paint these fresh cuts, I spray some paint on a foam brush. Then I went ahead and painted my 3/16 flat bar. Next, I cut up the dowel that will become the spacers. How far off of the wall you want your door mounted will determine the size of them. Then I took them to the drill press to drill an off-center hole, again starting with a smaller bit and working my way up. Last thing for the door is to mount a handle. For the install, I first located and measured the location of all of my studs, then drilled a corresponding hole in my flat bar, making sure that it was slightly off center. Then I clamped the flat bar to the 1x4 and drilled those holes. I moved the door inside and set it on a 1/2 inch piece of wood. Then I projected where the bottom of the V-track lands and made a mark. Then I was able to tack up my 1x4, come through and drill pilot holes, then use my impact to put in my leg bolts. To install the door, I slightly tilt it and then just set it in place. Before calling it quits, I mount a small right angle bracket with rubber glued to it to use as a doorstop on either side. When mounting these, make sure to use the longest screwdriver you can possibly find.
And there we are. Now this is a big project. There's quite a few steps involved. However, this is a very manageable do-it-yourself project. If you were to hire this out, it would be somewhere between $800 to $1,000. Between these two, I only spent $240. So it's quite a bit of money saved for just a little bit of my time. Now, I do have a written tutorial posted on my blog. It's chock full of a lot more details. So if this is a project that you do want to tackle, be sure to check it out. It's in the description of the video, but you can also find it at wilkerdues.com. Don't forget, December the 2nd, I'm going to be joining Bob Claggett at I Like to Make Stuff for his Brain Pit. It's a live Q&A to where y'all can hop online and ask us questions that y'all are curious about. So that's also in the description of the video. I'd love it if you would join us. No project video next week. However, I would love to hear your thoughts below on this project, and we'll see you soon.
In this video, I'm making a chair from 2 oak 1x4s. I want to explain more why and how I designed this chair, but that's a whole other video. I started with cutting all the pieces to rough length. I adjusted my miter saw blade to 2 degrees and cut the front and back rails and the backrest to the finished lengths, sneaking up on the cut. I then cut one end of the side rail to the right 16-degree angle and traced the rest of the shape with a pencil. I also could have glued the paper template on the wood for even more accurate lines, but decided not to. I cut the side rail shape on the bandsaw. I was being careful not to cut on the line, but instead right next to it. I left the other end long to trim it later. I clamped the side rails together and used my orbital sander to sand the curves smooth. This is an easy way to make sure the pieces are identical. I then taped them together and cut them to their finished length on the miter saw. I did the exact same process for the curved back leg design. By the way, I will be selling plans for this chair if you are interested. I will leave a link in the description of this video. If you are new to my channel, awesome! My name is Minni. I hope you like what you see and subscribe to see my future projects. But anyway, let's get back to the build. Next I got the front legs to their right width with a table saw. I then taped them together and cut them to final length. At this point I had all the parts cut except for the chair seat. I removed the tape and sanded all the parts, and then chamfered the corners with a hand plane. After I had all the pieces sanded, I started marking where I needed to drill holes for the through dowel joints. I used tape for a couple reasons. It keeps the wood clean of any pencil markings and also glue squeeze out during the glue up later on in the project. Next I drilled holes through all the parts. The great thing about through dowel joints is that you don't necessarily need a drill press to drill the holes. A regular battery-powered hand drill works just as well because the holes don't need to be exactly perpendicular to the surface. This is because with through dowel joints I can clamp each joint together on the worktop and use the holes I drilled as a drill guide to drill to the other piece. I was really happy how well this worked and how easy it was. I didn't need any special jigs for this step. I just made sure I marked both parts so that I could glue each joint together right. For the joints where the side rails connect to the front and back rails, I used a block to help me clamp the pieces together for drilling. After drilling the holes, I cut the dowels to length on the bandsaw and chamfered the ends to help with the glue up. I did the glue up in a couple stages. First I glued all the dowels in place to the other side of the joint. Then I glued the back legs to the backrest and back rail. I hammered the parts together and used my Japanese saw to cut the excess dowels away. I then clamped the parts together tightly. I did the same for the front legs and the front rail. Then I glued the whole frame together. I used these angled blocks and tape to help me with the clamping. After the glue had dried, I removed all the tape. I used a chisel to remove the dry glue squeeze out from the inside corners. Then I did a final sanding to sand the joints flush. Now I had the frame complete and I could start with the seat. The oak 1x4s I used had a slight chamfer on the edge, so I used a table saw to remove that so that I could have a nice straight edge for the glue up. I aligned the pieces the way I liked and marked them. I used plastic wrapped boards to help with the alignment. After the glue had dried, I used my orbital sander to sand the glue squeeze out the way. I then marked the sides of the seat and used a bandsaw to carefully cut the edge. After cutting it, I finished it with some sanding. For attaching the seat, I used these little L brackets, which allow the seat to expand and contract with humidity. I just marked their placement, pre-drilled holes and screwed them in place. For the finish, I used Osmo top oil in the color white oak. I wanted something that wouldn't darken the wood or make it yellow. What I like about it is that it's a very natural and durable matte finish. After letting it dry, the chair was finished. I really like the way this chair turned out. Designing it was a long process, but the end result was worth it. For me, the chair looks balanced and timeless, like I wanted it to. I hope you enjoyed watching this video.
Today I'm sharing how I upgraded the shelving unit, including how I made the barn door hardware. I started by covering up the holes and the edges with wood filler and sanding down the rough spots. I wanted to keep the rustic look of the shelving unit, so I went with a whitewash treatment instead of paint. I applied the whitewash mix with a brush first and then wiped off the excess with a damp rag. And please use gloves when you're doing this. I didn't, and my hands got covered in paint. After doing the first coat and letting that dry, I applied another coat to deepen the color. I didn't do this, but applying a coat of wax to seal the finish would be a good idea. The shelves had a lot of stains on them, so I decided to paint them instead of doing the whitewash treatment. With that done, next I wanted to add barn doors. I started looking online for some hardware, but everything that I saw was too big and expensive for what I needed. So I set out to find something to make my own hardware, and I was lucky to find these patio door roller kits that have 2 metal wheels that are the perfect size for my project. And then I found these 1-inch wide aluminum flat bars. There's one that's 8 feet long, which is perfect to make the track because it's going to cover the entire length of the shelving unit. And I also got a shorter one to make the hangers. I didn't have a jigsaw or a circular saw, so I used a hacksaw to cut the bars into 4 pieces. It's not ideal, but it does the job. Next, I drilled 3 holes into each of the 4 hangers. I started by making a divot with a nail, and this helps prevent the drill bit from slipping. I used a smaller drill bit first to be more precise, and then I made the hole bigger with a 1/4-inch drill bit. I used the first hanger as a template for drilling holes in the other hangers to make sure that they're all identical. I'll have a link to more details about the hangers in the video description below. The patio door roller kit comes with 2 wheels and lots of hardware. And all you need are these 2 larger bolts and nuts to secure the wheel to the bar. To make sure that the nut doesn't come undone, I just used a bit of glue that works with metal. And this will keep the nut in place while the wheel is still able to turn. I used a template to mark where to drill the holes on the door, and then it was easy to attach the hardware with more bolts and nuts. The bolts need to be about 1/2 inch longer than the thickness of the doors. Next, I drilled 8 holes evenly spread out over the 8-foot long bar, clamped it at the top of the shelving unit, and drilled pilot holes. The track needs to be installed away from the surface of the shelving unit to leave enough room for the door. I made my spacers using stainless steel straws. Turns out they have the perfect inside diameter for number 10 screws. I marked the length that I needed and used a mini pipe cutter to cut the straw. It took a bit of time, but it was pretty easy. The most important thing is to make sure that all the spacers are the same length to ensure that the track is straight. And that's all there is to it. And then it's just a matter of hanging the doors onto the track. The only thing I will need to add that I haven't done yet is some stoppers at the end of the track to prevent the doors from sliding off of it. I'll have links to all the things that I used for the hardware in the video description below.
So the finish on my bathroom vanity is a little bit worn out, and I thought about just refinishing everything, but instead I think I want to go ahead and make new drawer and door faces. I personally like the shaker style, so that's what I'm going to be building this week. First, I ripped off all of the doors and faces. The doors were held on by some simple screws, and these faux faces were held on by staples, so I used the claw of my hammer to pry it off. So with these drawers, I try to knock the faces off, but they're glued in place, so that's a no-go. I could run it through my bandsaw and cut them off, but I think I'm just going to go through the effort and make new drawers. But first I started the very tedious task of sanding. Since I'm wanting to stain these cabinets, I needed to get it down to the bare wood. I started off with a block sander, but I very quickly moved to the random orbital sander. And I also used my oscillating tool with a sanding pad attachment to get into the nook and crannies. My husband was awesome enough to help me out with this part. Then it was on to the shop to start making the new faces. I'm going to be making my rails and stiles 2 inches. So I grabbed some 1x3 oak and cut it down to 2 inches at my table saw. Then I set up a stop block at the miter saw to cut everything to length. These doors are going to be held together by tongue and groove joints. So next I moved back to the table saw and cut in a dado on one edge of every board. I'm going to be using 1/4 inch material for the inside panel, so I put in my 1/4 inch dado stack. I also put in 2 playing cards to act as additional spacers, just so it's slightly larger than a 1/4 inch. And then I started cutting in the dados. I kept things straight by grouping together the rails and stiles of each door. And after all the dados were cut, I then moved on to making the tongues on all of the rail pieces. I did this by increasing my dado stack to 1/2 inch because I wanted the tongues to be 1/2 inch. And I used my miter gauge and a temporary fence to help me cut it in. These tongues need to fit inside the dado or the groove that I just cut, so I would always test fit it before moving on just to make sure that it was a nice fit. Okay, with everything cut, I started dry fitting the pieces together. I would put a frame together and then measure the inside distance, so then I could figure out how big to cut the panel. Once I had the measurement, I used my table saw to cut 1/4 inch plywood down to size. Since I went with oak for the rails and stiles, I'm using oak plywood to match. Then it was on to applying the glue. Now, I only applied glue to the tongues of the rail pieces, so the inside panel is not actually glued into place. Once everything was glued together, I put it in clamps and set it aside to dry, after admiring it a little. I just repeated the steps to assemble the other doors. I'm going to be spraying on stain for a finish, and I'm using an HVLP sprayer made by HomeRite. Something I really liked about this sprayer was the air nozzle attachment. I used this to spray off all the dust before applying the stain. Then I poured the stain into the container, switched the nozzle back to a sprayer, and then started spraying. I don't have an area set up for finishing, so I set up some cardboard in the corner of my shop. And it was awesome just how quickly I was able to apply this stain. I have no idea why I haven't been using a sprayer up to this point. I applied the stain to the front side, then let it sit for about 5 minutes and then wiped it off. I flipped the boards around and then repeated the process to the back. While those were drying, I started with making the drawers. I started by cutting all of the sides, fronts, and backs to size using the table saw and miter saw. Then I switched out my table saw blade for a dado stack and cut in a dado along the bottom of the side pieces and the front pieces. I used pocket holes to put it all together, making sure that the pocket holes for the front piece were pointing forward since it will be covered up by a faux face, and the pocket holes in the back were pointing towards the back since nobody will ever see it. Then I cut to size and slipped in a bottom. And we're in the home stretch. Instead of buying new sliders, I'm reusing the ones from the old drawers. Okay, instead of making these two faux faces again, I bought some hardware to make them tip out drawers. Installing these is definitely a two-person job. And it certainly helps having a helping hand getting up from under the sink. For the drawer faces, I clamped it in place and then just screwed it in from the inside using 2 screws. So I am in love with this. I think that these shaker style doors really does a great job at updating the look of the vanity. And I went ahead and took out the majority of the gaps since I was remaking the faces anyways. I was aiming for 1/4 inch. The only place I ran into a problem was on these doors. I have a 2-inch face frame and I could only find 1 1/4 inch overlay hinges. So that means that I am left with a 3/4 inch reveal on both outside of these doors, which kind of throws off the look, but I was limited on the hardware available. But these faux faces are now functioning tip-out drawers, which gives us a little bit more storage. I didn't like the bins that came with the hardware, so I'm just going to end up making my own. And then these drawers are just the same as they've always been. Overall, I think that the process was relatively quick and easy. So if you're needing to update your vanity and want to switch to shaker style doors, then check out wilkerdoos.com. I do have more information in the tutorial on the overall process. So I hope that this was helpful to somebody, and I'll see you then next time I'm working on something.
So I'm here with my friend Coco, and in her very nice backyard.
Thank you.
And we're going to show you how to make this stool. It's a kind of a more fancy version of the bucket stool that I've done before. So what do you think? Difficult?
I love it. Just want to know whose butt's supposed to sit on it. Yours or mine?
We're going to cut this into 3 equal 16-inch pieces.
Yes, sir.
And this is walnut, so it's the same what we'll use with a credenza.
Okay.
It'll be the same material combination. Alright, so circular saw, battery powered, so it's lighter weight.
Okay.
So normally with a typical corded
girl,
ones.
it's fine.
Wasn't saying that.
I understood you.
Okay. So I'm just going to line up the blade to the mark,
Yep.
hold this down.
That looks easy.
So you get to do.
I'll tell you my story after I do this, so I
Yes.
don't terrify you.
So you just put your thumb on that, push that down, and then pull the trigger.
Where's my thumb? Wait, don't go. First this.
Yeah, and then pull the trigger. You can do a little test run just to see how it feels. Also good for surgeries, emergency amputations, difficult coconuts.
Oh my goodness, this is terrifying. Okay,
Yep. Yeah, set the guard on the dowel,
got it.
and then pull the trigger, and just go slow. Do it.
You trust me?
Sort of. You can go all the way.
No.
No problem. All right.
Is it perfect?
The most dangerous part is done. Well, that's the part going in the concrete, so
Oh, okay,
we're good.
okay, we're great. No, okay, now my story.
Okay.
In woodshop, I remember we were learning how to use that fancy one where you can like move it
Oh,
here
yeah.
and there.
Oh, the
And-
bandsaw.
Yeah, and my teacher was like, "Who would like to be the first student to do it?" For some reason, I put my hand up. No joke, did it, and then all of a sudden, I just see a teacher come over and
Right.
like rip my hand. No joke, I was probably like centimeters away from removing my thumb. So, thank you.
Your life would have gone such a different direction.
That hand modeling game would not have worked out.
Alright, so now, in the first bucket stool video I didn't drill holes and put wire through, and so after time the legs could sort of become loose.
Yeah.
So we're going to drill holes. Doesn't really matter where they are, just within an inch of the end.
It's like trying to show the world that if I can do it, anyone else can do it. There?
Yeah.
Ta-da!
And one more. So now we're going to wire them together so that they don't feel like these untangle.
I feel like you're a magician.
Yeah, with like they do the magic rings. This is probably how it works. This is too
This
challenging.
is where we can do a speed version.
The Charlie
With the music
Chaplin.
like that. Da, da, da.
So, all right, we're ready for concrete stuff.
Yay.
So this is an 80-pound bag.
Got it.
So the most difficult thing of working with concrete is getting it home.
Understood.
So we're
So
gonna
find yourself someone strong, you're telling me, to do these things.
yes, exactly. So we're just gonna measure 3 inches from the bottom of the bucket,
Why is that?
so we know how full to fill it. Full to fill it. Full to fill it. And we're also going to mark where the legs are going to go, because we're that precise. You can start stirring. As I have. And now I don't understand why they make cement mixers.
Dumbest stink ever.
Good luck.
Shut up. This is not a stirring thing.
Tricky, right? Turn on the side.
No one told me it was gonna get dirty.
You want to see the pro technique?
Please.
So yeah, people always kind of like mix it like a cake.
Yes.
And it's really more of like, you dig out like a little spot, and then you let the water fill in behind it.
You told me to dig.
We need a demonstration of like, so people appreciate
How not to do it and how to do it.
you get to be the before. Now we're just getting the air bubbles out. Good enough. Alright.
Okay.
These guys in.
This is so easy. easy.
I think the only thing that you can really screw up is just pushing them in too far, where they all the way to where they're touching the
So how
bottom.
much did I put?
Like that, just to cover the wire. So I know I drilled the wire about like an inch in, and this is 3 inches, so I know if the wire's just barely covered, then I'm pretty good. And they're not really lining up with their marks, so I'm going to get some duct tape. Alright, so now we just have to wait about 48 hours.
Okay.
Since we're not going to wait, we're
We're
going to pull the already done one out of the oven.
No, we're gonna wait 48 hours.
Okay.
Because we're that
We'll
into this.
All right.
48 hours. Have you been?
Good. So you gotta get it out. So the buckets like flex a little bit, so you just sort of bend it.
That would be it.
Yep. It's just to separate the concrete from the bucket.
I don't need to like shove something down there.
I mean, maybe if we can't get it out, but okay. See if we can grab the legs and shove them like down by the base, and see if we can pull them straight out.
That is so heavy.
That was more because of stuff.
Are you kidding me? How are you gonna make that other thing? It is so. Now it's not good. Wow.
So you can see where the bucket deformed a little bit, but I actually kind of like it. It feels a little bit wavy.
Yeah, button up.
Exactly. We can actually do like
Cute.
imprints and stuff. So I'm going to just take, the concrete's still a little bit, it's not fully cured. So if I want, I can just shave down the edges to make it a little bit more curved. And I could also use sandpaper.
I think I would screw that up.
No.
I think I would do
Right.
it.
You don't need much pressure, just scrape. Yeah, I'm just taking the edge off a little bit. So we're just going to sand these really quick.
What's red and what's black?
So sandpaper is by grit, so this is 220. So that means it has, for every square inch, 220 pieces of sand. So the higher the number, the smoother the sandpaper. So this is 400. Very smooth. So this is just Danish oil. It's just like linseed oil and some other stuff. And now we don't want to spill this on the concrete because the concrete will sort of absorb it. So we're just going to pour it on the rag. Very nice.
Very
So
nice.
we'll let that dry a little bit, and then we're going to dye the legs. This is just high gloss house paint. You can really use anything.
Now can I use a Fiji water bottle?
You could switch up your water bath, but these are like the tall, skinny ones, so minimal.
Smell it?
So the first time I did this, I filled it all the way full, and then, yeah,
Screwed up. Even I knew that wasn't a good idea.
I was just so excited.
Like playing, remember Doctor? Don't
Yes,
touch the
with the-
edges.
So now we just have to hold this up for, and most of the drips are off. And that part's gonna get scraped off anyway, so.
So pretty.
That looks really nice. That looks super clean. I mean, you can just like tape it and paint it with a brush, but it doesn't have that same sort of like dipped candy kind of black and white cookie feel.
This ping pong table is made of solid walnut legs with mortise and tenon joinery. The top is made of plywood with a brass inlay down the center and a solid wood border to cover up the plywood edges. Want to see how I built it? Alright, let's get started. First I started with the mortise and I marked out where I wanted it to go, and I put some double-sided tape on a piece of hardboard to mark one edge of the mortise. I used a scrap 2x4 and marked off the other edge, also creating a depth stop for my drill, and I just hogged away with a Forstner bit to clear out most of the material. It looks really bad right now, I know. Then I used a chisel to clean up all those little pointy parts that the Forstner bit left over. That part's really important because you don't want to put a router in something where the little pointy things are sticking out. I cleaned it all up to the depth that I wanted, and voila, a mortise. Next up, I worked on the tenon. I used my crosscut sled to establish a shoulder on all 4 sides of my workpiece. And then used a tenoning jig to cut away at the cheeks, to create the tenon. I decided to round off the tenon instead of square off the mortise. It seemed easier to me. I don't know why. And I just kept paring away until it finally fit. And I sanded the insides of all the legs and took a tea break, but nobody wants to see me sand. Time for assembly! I assembled all the pieces together. Bing, bing, bing. Fit perfectly. Clamp it up. Check for square. Now it's time to work on the top. I used plywood, walnut plywood, and I decided to put a brass inlay in the middle down the line of the ping pong table, and I used my router to put in the inlay, just cut off some excess, file down some high points. It's really easy to work with. It filed, sanded so nicely. It just, look at that. Come on. Walnut brass, beautiful. I used my Kreg jig to make some pocket holes around all the edges of the plywood, and I put on the hardwood borders to cover up the ugly plywood sides. See my double clamping action there? Yeah, I think I need longer clamps. Anyway, I think this is the part where I messed up the most, where I think next time if I do it, I would use biscuits to align the plywood with the hardwood. And there you have it. This is what it looks like now. So I was building this on the fly, and I realized at this point that I needed to notch out the middle hardwood section to make room for the supports that were going to go under the table. So circular saw and chisel to the rescue. Chisel, chisel. Love that thing. And it fits. The supports now fit flat against the plywood. And I did the same thing with the table legs, only this time I decided to use my router because it seemed cleaner and quicker. But routers are really, really messy. I used my crosscut sled again to make notches in the supports. I'm making a half lap here if you haven't guessed yet. I need a dado stack. This is ridiculous already. It's a little bit tedious, but it works. And now the oak supports fit perfectly into the legs, creating a flat surface for the plywood to sit on. Some finishing touches, some filing, and some sanding. And onto the finish. I used Rubio Monocoat Pure Oil. It's just amazing stuff. You do one coat and done. Look at that. Look at the old man. You see the old man with the monocle? I'm just gonna let you enjoy this little bit in silence. And it's done! Brand! Woohoo! Well, not completely done. Now I had to assemble on location. I put the supports in the half laps and I pre-drilled and screwed the supports to the table legs. Now I just needed to attach the 2 halves of the top. I only did it like this because my car doesn't fit a full sheet and this was the only way that I could transport it. Next, I pre-drilled into the oak supports through the top of the table and I screwed it all down. And done! It works! She didn't fall! If you want more details on this build, just let me know in the comments below. Maybe a more informative tutorial video or a more DIY friendly version without the mortise and tenon. Just shoot me a comment or email, my website, Instagram, Facebook, you know the whole thing. Like, share, comment.
should say more donuts. More fat cake. More nom nom. More cream horns. More cream horns. Hey Ash, give me your hand. If you don't have a sister to hold your coffee for you, you're probably going to need a coffee table. So we're going to show you how to build an 8-board farmhouse coffee table. 8 boards. You're only going to need 4 of these and 4 of these. And don't forget, 4 of these. And you can build it for under $40 in lumber. Heck yeah. More time for coffee. More money for coffee. Not time. This is not my first rodeo. It's my second. We can't do cow jokes until not yet. People know what the cow jokes are for. I'm just warming up. We've already made all of our cuts for this coffee table, and we've also ripped our boards. Our 2x6s are going to be 5 inches wide, and our 2x4s are going to be 3 inches wide. Okay, the first thing we're going to do to build this table is build our 2 bottom leg pieces. And these are going to be those X pieces that you see, and we're attaching everything with 2.5-inch pocket hole screws. We've already made all of the cuts for this using our miter saw, and Whitney is making the pocket holes. And I'm just sitting here. Warm it up, Chris. All right, and guys, you definitely don't need a Kreg jig to build this table, but the more building you're gonna do, the more you're gonna want this tool. I think it's one of our top 5s for sure. Well, I know it is. When we started building, we didn't use the Kreg jig, and then we discovered the Kreg jig, and we were like, we're never building without it. 7 years later, we're still building with it. I don't know if I need a new drill bit or if this is... There's a couple of those had really big knots in them. Okay. They're just knotty wood. Yeah. So naughty. So naughty. Okay. All right, pocket holes are done, and now we are going to be building the frame. Tip here is you need to have your pocket holes facing up and facing down because they're going to be hidden. If you turn it the wrong way, people are going to see your pocket holes, which defeats the whole purpose. So Ash is going to be attaching everything with wood glue and 2.5-inch pocket hole screws. I'm not going to be attaching everything. Whitney's going to help out too. Good point. I do need to get your drill. Okay, so this is the first one. Notice pocket holes facing up, and then I'm going to attach one at the bottom, and the pocket holes are going to face down. Oh, hello. Mine's done. Mine's done too. Now what's next? Now we're going to make our X pieces. So I'm going to get the wood for that. And instead of just giving you the measurements to cut for those X pieces and having you cut them before you start building, we're going to show you how we get these exact cuts so that it's a perfect fit every time. So the first thing we're doing is we're laying our longboard down, and Ashley's going to mark where we're going to be making these cuts just by running a pencil along the line where it meets that edge of the frame. Once you make your first long cut, you can then hold up the shorter pieces and mark those and make those cuts on your saw, and you're ready to attach. Ooh. Perfect fit. X marks the spot. All right, we're gonna take those pieces out, but before we take those pieces out of the box frame, make sure that you mark exactly where they're sitting, like a line from one to the other. Key tip, mark them before you take them out. Okay, all right, so now I'm gonna put some glue on the end of this piece, and then I'm gonna put it where I marked. My hand is very far away from the nailer. And guys, these are not structural. These are not going to hold the weight of that table, which is why we're able to use the glue and the nails and not pocket holes on this part. Okay. All right, I'm going to put it in now. And if it's a tight fit, that means that your cuts are really good. So ours are always really tight. Perfect. We have our X's now in place, and we're going to use our nailer with 2-inch nails going through the outside of those frames. My turn. Ashley's turn. We're sharing today. We normally don't share tools. Okay, awesome. So we have both of our X's done at this point, and now we're going to add our top and bottom diagonal feet pieces. That's what we're going to call them, diagonal feet pieces. So these are going to be diagonal pieces that are going to run the same length of these boxes that we just built, and then we're going to have 45-degree angles going up. And remember, you can download the free plans on our site so you don't have to remember all these measurements. We are attaching all of these with 2.5-inch back screws and wood glue. So we're going to put a big glob of glue. All right. Don't forget, guys, you can download the free plans with all these measurements on our website. Link in the description box. Bases are done. Now it's time to build the top of the table and the bottom shelf. Now, one thing we've done, and we've done it with all of these boards, guys, is we've ripped these down. So our 2x4s are actually 3 inches and our 2x6s are actually 5 inches. We have a video on that we show you exactly how we do that, so check that out. And we've also added our pocket holes. Do you want me to get silver screws out?
Yeah, these are the powder-coated ones that aren't very good. That's good.
Here we go. These boards use 1.5-inch pocket holes, and we are planking them and attaching those planks together using 2.5-inch pocket hole screws. Pocket holes facing up. Okay, it's breadboard time. And we're gonna go and mark these so we can have an exact cut.
It's a great tip for breadboards. Wait to cut your breadboards until you get to that point so that you can get an exact fit. Tabletop is done. Now let's move on to the shelf.
Okay. The shelf is going to be assembled the exact same way. 1.5-inch pocket holes, and we're attaching all those planks with 2.5-inch pocket hole screws.
How did you come up with the design for this table?
Well, I wanted something smaller. I've had a really big table in there, and with my growing family and all the baby toys, I wanted something that took up a little less space. So I just kind of came up with this design.
I like the size of it because it'll go with any type of couches. Like you have the sectional, but if you had 2 like smaller couches, it would still fit really well with 2 smaller couches.
The size is perfect.
Yeah. I think a lot of our coffee tables we've built based on the size of our couches and our sectionals, and sometimes they're too big for people, so this one's perfect.
That's a good point. Okay, bottom shelf complete.
Now we can add the runner.
We have our runner. Okay, add some glue there. Glue me.
Okay.
And glue me here.
Glued up.
And we are attaching those with 2.5-inch pocket hole screws. That runner is going to be the same length as our shelf, 33 inches. And we are going to attach that to both of our leg pieces. You want to make sure that you line it up center and flush.
To attach that bottom shelf, we're going to flip the whole table base up on its side and attach that shelf 3/4 of an inch from the bottom of the bases. Make sure your pocket holes are facing down on this shelf.
Yes, because you don't want anyone to see those. And I'm going to go ahead and mark just to give her a good line. That'll be 3/4 of an inch there, 3/4 of an inch there. Same up here and right here. We want to do a good amount of wood glue on this because it's a shelf. Because I have the glue bot, so I can do this. What do you call that? Upside down gluing?
Yeah. It's a superhero power, really.
Yeah. I'm going to lift this up just a little bit so you can get it in there.
All right.
Okay, and we have it lined up, and we're going to attach those with a 2.5-inch pocket hole screws. Just get it lined up. Let me get the
middle one.
So I'm going to push this out of the way. Once that's attached, your entire base assembly is finished.
I love that you made this with 2x because it's so beefy and like strong.
Yes. I do, and it makes it inexpensive too.
Yeah.
Now we're speaking my language.
Okay,
so
you need
it's
to
going to
come
come
this
towards
way.
you quite a bit, yeah. We're going to use 2.5-inch back screws through that runner and into the tabletop, and that's what's going to hold everything in place. I'm going to do several because I have several children. 1 screw for each kid.
I don't think you need to pop nails in it.
All right.
I love how solid this is.
It's beefy. So at this point, guys, you can stain it, paint it, do whatever you want. We even added some cute hardware to ours.
But that's $40 in lumber, 8 boards, about an hour of work, and we've got a 8-board farmhouse coffee table.
And a place to put our coffee. 40 bucks. Really, to me, it doesn't look like we made it with framing lumber.
It doesn't look like a $40 table when it's in that room. Let's go get some coffee.
Good plan.
Hey guys, if you've been following me on Instagram, you would know I'm doing a whole revamp of my shop. I've been putting in some storage, painting, cleaning it up, and getting some new awesome tools. And the last thing on my list today, I'm going to be building a scrap bin cut-off rolling storage cart kind of thing. I don't know what to name it yet. We'll see what the title of this video will be.
I started out by breaking down some plywood. I just based the dimensions on the space that I had and the materials that I had. So I went with 20 inches deep and 5 feet wide, just using that AccuCut to break it down. I had to flip it around to get to the other side since it's longer than 4 feet long. And next up, I took a 10-foot long 2x4 and split it in half, so it was 2 5 feet long pieces. Then cut up another 2x4 to 16 and 3/4 inches, I guess. I cut 4 of those pieces, and then I also cut some 1-inch blocks to put in the corners to so that I could attach the casters, so that there's a wide enough space to attach the casters. I pre-drilled, and did I pre-drill? You know what, I don't think I did. I think I probably should have, but I was being lazy, and this was just a shop project, so I wasn't being too careful about anything. I probably should have pre-drilled, whatever. So you see all those 1-inch pieces in the corners. That's so that the casters have enough space to screw it down in. If I didn't have those that 1-inch piece there, I would only be able to use 3 screws into my casters, which would not be good enough. Then after the whole frame was assembled with screws, I just screwed down the casters. I think I used 2-inch screws to put them in. You know, I'm really not sure. I just used a box of random screws that I had lying around. That's why I have 2 different drills there. They had different heads in them. Some were the square drive, some were Phillips, some I don't even know what they were. And it rolls. Gotta test it out. Secure down the top with a brad nailer. I love using this brad nailer, it's just so much fun. Next, I prepared the upright support for the storage bins. I did 5 feet wide again, and 3 feet tall. I put some pocket holes in the bottom, and anyone who's used a Kreg jig before knows exactly why I wrote that on it. Then I just took that piece of plywood and attached it onto the rolling base using pocket hole screws. And if this was more than a shop project, I probably would have put a dado across the bottom of the base to make it really straight. Next up, I worked on the bin dividers. They are around 5 1/4 inches wide and 20 inches tall. And the front of the cart is going to be 12 inches tall, so I needed to make an angle to accommodate for that. The angle was a little too steep for my table saw, so I did it on the bandsaw and just cleaned it up on the belt sander. I took those bin dividers and drilled a bunch of pocket holes in them and attached them to the base and the back using pocket screws. If you'd rather look at pictures and see written words, I actually broke it down a little bit more on my website. I'll have a link down below somewhere. I attached the apron with pocket holes on the back as well, and the front was done. Now it's time to work on the back. So I took a 2x4 and ripped off that rounded edge that it comes with, and on the other side of it, I ripped an 8-degree angle. I'm not sure why I chose 8. It was more than 5, less than 10. It just seemed right. Next, I put some pocket holes into that 2x4 on the straight side, not the angled side. So the straight side is going to be attached to the back support like this, and the angled side is like facing towards me, where a plywood is going to be leaning against it. It's going to be a little bit on an angle. So I didn't have enough plywood on hand to support the whole back, so instead I cut down just 4 supports to put on the back out of plywood and got them all down to size, all with that 8-degree angle on the top and the bottom of it. Next, I worked on the cleats for the middle shelf part. I ripped 1-inch wide pieces that had the 8-inch angle on one side and cut them down to 3.5 inches wide, because that's how wide the supports were that I put in the back. And then I attached them onto the supports about 12 inches up from the bottom using my Ryobi brad nailer. Once again, I just love that thing. And then the second row, I did another 12 inches up and tacked it all down. Off camera, I ripped another 1-inch cleat that was 5 feet long that fit along the whole back of the support. Yeah, there it is. So I tacked it all down with the brad nailer as well. And I used a 12-inch spacer just to make sure that it was the same height all along. and I did that on the top part as well. If you follow me on Instagram, you probably already saw this. That's where I usually post all my real-time updates on my build, so if you're interested in that, definitely check out my Instagram. Oops, I didn't post that on Instagram. So I took a board and made sure that all of the supports were at the same measurement. I don't like to measure, so doing stuff like this is just a lot easier. Then I nailed it all down, not nailed, I screwed it all down from the top, and I used pocket holes to screw in the bottoms. Now I am attaching on a lip onto the back. I think this was a 1x5 board, and I'm just screwing it down, and this is what's going to stop the plywood from falling off the back. The last step was to put in the shelves for the middle. I'm kind of really happy that I didn't have a whole sheet of plywood to work with, and I have these open shelves and things can't get lost in the middle of them. I'm kind of really happy that it turned out like this. Now I just tacked it all down with my brad nailer again, and it's done. I am just so happy I have a place for all this stuff. All those pieces of plywood, I could have used those for cleats and things like that, and all these scraps, I'm going to use them, and now I can find them finally. I'm just so happy.
Today we're making a mini shelf to store external hard drives. I will be using solid maple and some little pieces of plywood that I got from the Inventables online store. I measured the hard drives and made a sketch before jumping on the project. I first planed them, and I'm not sure why, but this thickness planer has a particular interest in blowing half of the chips to the front. Then I cut one fresh edge on each board at the miter saw. Came inside to trace the measurements, and the sun went down so quickly that it became super dark even before 6 p.m. Well, I guess winter is coming one more time. In the right piece, I wanted to make 3 grooves to slide the tiny shelves, and for that I went to the router table. These are stopped grooves, which mean that I need some reference lines to start or stop routing. I hit the stop button with my hip and wait for the router bit to stop completely. Most of the dust was running to the front, so I decided to put a box in the table to collect it. Now I need to square up those grooves and make them exactly the same length. Super handy to have the most used hand tools right where you're working. Took my time squaring up the ends, and then went outside to cut 3 pieces of plywood to make the floating shelves. I didn't have enough maple, so this is why I had to find this solution. You probably have noticed that when I make dust, I typically wear a mask and the ones that I've been using the last year are super comfortable and convenient, and that is something that I really appreciate, because if it's hard to put on or you don't feel comfortable, you'll end up not using it. But these RZ mats are lightweight, very protective, and so small that they can fit inside a pocket. And you can even customize them by choosing different colors to fit your style. So I totally recommend them, and your lungs won't thank you enough. I don't want the plies to be visible, so I cut a few strips of maple to hide the edges. Whoops, the push block hit the riving knife, so I had to flip the piece over and finish the cut. I checked out the fit and noticed that the grooves were a bit wider than they were supposed to, but the problem here was actually the plywood, as half-inch plywood nowadays is not exactly half-inch, so even though the router bit was correct, the pieces don't fit snugly. Anyway, let's keep going. I glued the edge strip on the longer side of the mini shelves and utilized masking tape to clamp them, but you can also use these handy bendy clamps. Flushed all the edges with the block plane and cut off the remaining length. I then repeated the process to the front edges. Now I need to cut a little bit in the front for the shelves to sit flush in the back. This marking blade was a birthday gift from Alex that makes all kinds of awesome knives, and you can check out his channel right there in the top corner. Here I was super careful, trying not to move the box while tracing a few lines to add dowels using a jig from Rockler. Super easy to make matching holes, as all there is to it is to place the jig aligned with the pencil lines. Now you know that the center of the hole is in the center of the line. Just make sure to set the correct depth in a drilling bit so that you don't drill all the way through. The same applies to the edge holes. I cut the dowels in half and started gluing everything in place. I always stress a lot on glue up, so I just stopped filming and restarted when the clamps were secure. I scraped the glue before it set completely because the rubbery consistency makes it much easier and doesn't leave much residue on the wood. I clamped the box to the table so I could flush the edges with a hand plane. and gave a little sanding to prepare for finish. I glued the shelves and let them dry just like that, making sure they were sit properly square in the grooves. There's gonna be really low weight on them, so this is more than fine. I didn't want the maple to become darker or yellow, so I applied 2 coats of acrylic matte varnish. Finally, I stick some silicone bumpers and it was done. To make it easier to identify each cable, I went to my Carvey and engraved some tiny labels out of a thin piece of maple. I know it sounds a bit weird, but these are the names that I ended up giving to my hard drives along the years. I left some tabs on the carving, so I needed to sand them and finally apply some sticking tape to the back. So here it is, the final piece. I think it came out really nice, and I hope this helps me to keep the desk more organized, although I need to get some longer cables because some of the hard drives came with really short ones, and there's no chance to plug them to the computer without removing them from the shelf. Thanks for watching, and a big shout out to all my Patreon supporters, as well as to Rockler, RZ Mask, and Inventables that make my ideas come to life. Thanks everyone, I'll catch you later.